After the overwhelming response to the first video on ego death, it became clear that this conversation was far from over. In fact, your comments and questions have taken this discussion much deeper than I originally anticipated. The idea of ego death is complex. It touches on survival, identity, consciousness, and even what it means to live a fulfilling life. So today, we're diving into your counterarguments, exploring the ideas that emerged from the community, and uncovering even more about what it means to truly die before dying. Many of you raised an important question. Can the ego actually be killed, or is it too deeply embedded in our biology to ever disappear? This point, raised by VN Expo 5729 and others, touches on the core of what ego death really means. Biologically, the ego evolved as part of our survival mechanism. It ensures we protect ourselves, keep our bodies safe, and in a very primal sense, helps us survive. In life-threatening situations, the ego takes over. That's why it exists. So in this sense, the ego can never be fully killed. However, ego death isn't about destroying the ego. It's about shifting your identification with it. The ego remains a part of you, a tool for navigating the world, but it no longer defines who you are. It no longer dominates your sense of self. The freedom in ego death comes not from killing the ego, but from realizing that you are not bound by it. The ego will still rise in moments of fear or danger, but it won't control your every thought, action, or emotion. So the real question isn't whether we can kill the ego, but whether we can stop identifying with it as the core of who we are. Does ego death mean losing individuality? Jacob Dada raised a valid concern about ego death leading to herd behavior. Without the ego, does it mean we lose our individuality and become just another part of the crowd? It's easy to imagine that letting go of the ego might make us indistinct, blending into some kind of collective mass without a sense of self. But the reality is quite the opposite. Ego death doesn't dissolve your individuality. It actually reveals your true individuality, the part of you that isn't driven by the need for validation, comparison, or social approval. When you stop clinging to the ego's identity, you don't become less of an individual. In fact, you become more authentically yourself because you're no longer being pushed and pulled by societal expectations or personal insecurities. You realize that your individuality isn't based on what you own, what you achieve, or how you compare to others. It's deeper than that. It's the expression of your true nature, one that exists without ego-driven motives. So, ego death doesn't erase who you are. It lets you live more freely and authentically without the constant noise of the ego. At Joshi Joshi's experience with ego death was striking. They described it as both torturous and freeing, feeling like all personality, emotions, and desires had disappeared. Yet in that, there was a strange sense of liberation. And this paradox is real. Ego death can feel like losing everything, including the parts of yourself you've spent your whole life building up, your identity, your goals, your sense of purpose. But here's the twist. What you lose isn't the actual self. What you lose is your attachment to it. The ego has a way of convincing you that you are your thoughts, your desires, your achievements, and your emotions. But when you experience ego death, you realize that you aren't losing these things. You're just no longer defined by them. The emotions, thoughts, and experiences still exist, but they stop controlling your sense of self. The pain of ego death comes from the ego fighting for its existence. But once you pass through that, you experience a level of freedom and presence that the ego could never provide. It's the freedom to feel, think, and live without being tied down to a false narrative of I. And now shortcuts. The question of using psychedelics to experience ego death, raised by Aki Gruss 9424, brings up an important caution. While psychedelics can induce a temporary state of ego dissolution, they are not a sustainable or reliable path to ego death. These substances might give you a glimpse of what it feels like to let go of the ego, but they can also lead to confusion, trauma, and disintegration without proper support. Psychedelics can open a door, but they don't guarantee transformation. True ego death doesn't come from a quick experience. It comes from sustained inner work. Meditation, self-inquiry, and deep reflection gradually peel back the layers of ego, leading to a lasting transformation that no substance can offer. Drugs can provide an intense but fleeting experience, but the real path to ego death is a slow, deliberate process of awakening. It's about being present in the discomfort, facing the illusions of the ego head-on, and ultimately realizing the truth that has been hidden beneath those layers all along. A profound counterargument was raised about the practicality of ego death for those struggling to meet basic needs. How can someone focus on spiritual growth if they're worried about survival, if they don't have shelter, food, or safety? This is an important point. Spiritual growth, including the pursuit of ego death, does require a certain level of stability. When your body and mind are in constant survival mode, it's nearly impossible to turn inward and focus on self-inquiry. So yes, in a sense, ego death and even spirituality can seem like a privilege or luxury, as it requires having your basic physical and mental needs met to create the space for spiritual exploration. However, you don't need to be ultra-rich or free from all challenges to pursue it. What you need is enough stability to be able to look within. Once the foundational needs of life are covered, ego death becomes accessible to anyone willing to explore it, regardless of their material circumstances. At Anonymous Prime pointed out a potential contradiction in the way spiritual teachings often say, "You are not your thoughts," or "You are not your ego." Doesn't this create a duality, implying that there's a separation between the self and the world? It's an insightful critique, and it reveals the limitations of language when it comes to describing these deeper truths. When we say, "You are not your thoughts," or "You are not your ego," it's not meant to be taken as the ultimate truth. Instead, it's a step, a tool to guide you toward a greater understanding, that you are not just your thoughts or your ego, but rather you are the all. Language by its nature is limited. It's a tool that can distort as much as it clarifies. If we were to speak from the ultimate truth, we would first come to silence, which is the most accurate reflection of that truth. After silence, the only thing left to say is "I am," but even that is a limited expression of the infinite. Everything beyond this becomes a blurrier version of the truth, because words are symbols and not the reality itself. The phrase "you are not" helps break down the layers of false identification, ego, thoughts, personality, so that we can move closer to the deeper truth, which is not a void or separation, but a profound interconnectedness. In that sense, practices like neti neti, not this, not that, help us peel away layers of misidentification, guiding us to the realization that we are the awareness behind it all. One comment questioned whether, if ego death is true, everything we've been told about self-love is just another lie. It raised the concern that if we're supposed to dissolve the ego and transcend the self, then isn't all this talk about self-love just another trap? Shouldn't we be focused on destroying the self entirely instead of nurturing it? This leads us to the topic of self-love. Many people talk about self-love, but we need to clarify. Self-love is not about loving the ego, the achievements, or the mask you wear in society. True self-love is about loving the mammal, the human organism that lives beneath all the layers of personality and identity. It's about nurturing the vulnerable, innocent creature that you are at your core, the living being, not the narrative of who you think you are. Loving the ego is like loving a mask, a role you've been assigned. But loving the being underneath is about embracing your humanity, your vulnerability, your raw existence. The ego might tell you that self-love is about boosting your confidence or reinforcing your self-image, but real self-love is far deeper. It's about acknowledging the mammal you are, this living, breathing entity that simply wants to exist in peace. The more you connect with that, the less you need the ego's validation. True self-love doesn't reinforce the ego. It's about loving the being that exists beyond the stories, beyond the personality, beyond the masks. This is why ego death doesn't mean we have to stop loving ourselves. It means we stop loving the illusions and start loving the essence of our existence. And here we arrive at one of the most interesting insights from the community: the illusion that you've completely killed the ego. VN Expo 5729 pointed out that sometimes the very thought that you've transcended the ego is actually the ego's last trick. The ego has a way of hiding in plain sight, even convincing you that it's gone, when in reality it's just taken on a new form. The truth is, you don't kill the ego, you stop identifying with it. The ego will always exist as part of the human experience, but when you realize that you are not the ego, its power over you diminishes. The moment you think you've fully killed the ego is often the moment it has found a new disguise. This is why ego death isn't about elimination, it's about transcendence. You see the ego for what it is, a tool, not your identity. It loses its control, not because you've killed it, but because you no longer believe in the illusion that it is you. This leads to a tough question that Gabo352 asked. If the ego dies, what survives after death? Is everything lost? This is the hard pill to swallow. Nothing you currently identify with will persist beyond death. Your name, your personality, your memories, none of these will survive. And that idea is the root of suffering. The ego clings to these identities, fearing that without them, nothing remains. But here's the deeper truth. When you let go of these attachments, you begin to identify with something far greater than the individual self. You identify with the energy, the awareness that underlies all existence. You are not lost. What survives is the essence, the consciousness that was never bound to the ego in the first place. Finally, we come to the core idea of die before dying. This phrase points to a profound spiritual truth. If you identify solely with the ego, then realizing the ego is an illusion will feel like a kind of death. It's the death of everything you believed yourself to be, your identity, your history, your achievements. But this death is not the end. It's a necessary step toward rebirth, toward discovering your true self, which is the energy, the awareness, the consciousness behind it all. In many spiritual traditions, this idea is central. Jesus, for example, famously said, "If you want to follow me, you must deny yourself." That denying yourself is precisely the ego death we've been discussing. It's not about rejecting your existence. It's about letting go of the false self, the illusions, and embracing the reality of what you truly are. Similarly, other great mystics like Buddha and Rumi spoke of dissolving the ego to experience unity with the whole. The process of dying before dying means letting the ego fall away so you can awaken to your deeper, true nature. You're not losing yourself, you're resurrecting into your real self, which has always been there, waiting beneath the surface. The energy, the consciousness that animates all of life, that is your true identity. When the ego dissolves, what remains is pure awareness. This is the freedom that every spiritual teacher has pointed to. The recognition that you are not just the thoughts, the fears, or the desires that come and go, but the vast, unchanging awareness behind them. It's a difficult process. This letting go feels like death because the ego clings so tightly to its illusions. But once you pass through that, you're reborn into a life where you no longer need to defend or validate your existence. Instead, you experience the fullness of life as it is, free from the distortions of the ego. Thank you for sharing your thoughts and engaging in this deeper exploration of ego death. Your insights and questions have enriched this conversation in ways I couldn't have imagined. If you're ready to continue exploring the path of ego death and beyond, hit that like button, drop a comment, and subscribe. Remember, true freedom comes when you stop believing in the illusions